It was one of those dark days during the medieval Inquisitions. A group of inquisitors were looking at a man who was strapped to a chair. He'd not only been accused of heresy, but his captors also believed this guy had been dabbling in the dark arts, what they referred to as maleficium. The captive sat with his head in his hands, sobbing, pleading to the inquisitors. He was well aware that even though he'd confessed to a crime he hadn't committed, he was due for another round of torture. This time he was expected to give the names of the witches he'd allegedly been working with. There were no witches, of course. But what's a man supposed to do when he's presented with one of the most monstrous torture devices ever created? Today we're going to talk about 3 devices in one show. The reason for that is because their application was quite similar in that they were designed to crush or mutilate a part of the body in order to extract a confession or information. The other reason is it's thought they were all used during Inquisitions. When many of you hear the word Inquisition, the thing that likely springs to your mind is a bunch of barbaric Spanish Roman Catholics in the late Middle Ages investigating anyone accused of not practicing their religion, whether they were pagans or folks belonging to another religion. It's true that many Jewish people in Spain were brutally tortured and killed, and even if they did convert, life was still often very difficult for those people. Those conversos were still met with suspicion and experienced discrimination. Muslims were also persecuted, killed, or just kicked out of Spain. Under Tomás de Takamata, Spain's Grand Inquisitor, many hundreds of accused heretics were burned at the stake. During the late 15th century and early 16th century, it was a bad time not to be a Roman Catholic. And as you'll soon see, being burned at the stake was sometimes just a blood-stained cherry on top of a very ugly cake. The Spanish Inquisition was a monster with very long tentacles, so wherever Spain had interests abroad, there was bloodshed in the name of the Catholic Church. We don't want you to think that it was only people inside Spain that suffered. That's far from the truth. Then there was the Portuguese Inquisition and the Roman Inquisition, and prior to that, the medieval Inquisitions, and those went back to the 12th century and spanned much of Europe. The torture and executions and persecutions only really stopped in the 19th century. So when we're talking about the Inquisition, well, it's complicated. Anyone deemed non-Catholic could have been the target, and that included so-called witches and even scientists. You might recall the fact that the brilliant scientist Galileo Galilei got on the wrong side of the Catholic Church. This father of modern physics was accused of heresy by the Inquisitors, but he kept his head and his knees and accepted a life sentence of house arrest. He was never tortured like some unlucky heretics, but he was threatened with torture. We're telling you all this because when we're talking about brutality handed down by those inquisitive Catholics, it went on for centuries, often behind closed doors, and the Inquisitors used all kinds of ways to hurt people. How many people were tortured or executed or both is a matter of mystery, since historians can't agree. Some say as many as 30,000 people were executed during the Spanish Inquisitions alone, while others put the number much higher, others lower. How many people died at the hands of the Inquisitors from the 12th to the 19th century is a bigger mystery. Maybe it was hundreds of thousands, but some historians would disagree. So that brings us to today's torture devices. As you know from some of our other punishment shows, there's a chance that some torture devices sitting in museums today weren't even used, or not used often. Stories of how other unusual torture devices were used could have been greatly exaggerated by people who talked about them a century or two after they were supposedly employed for the last time. Okay, in terms of crappy things that can happen to you in this life, having your head slowly crushed has to be in the top 5. You might have seen what the first stages of such an act looks like if you've ever seen the movie Casino. A scene in that film shows a man's head being crushed in a vice, something that was based on fact. Apparently, in real life, the mobster named Anthony Spilotro actually did that until the man's eye popped out. The guy soon talked, so the torture wasn't taken to messy conclusions. He did, however, have his throat cut after being set on fire. That would have been quite a fitting way to die at the hands of a Catholic interrogator. During the Inquisition, the instrument used to crush a head was slightly different, in that the head would be placed under a kind of dome-shaped lid. The chin would be supported on something below, so the head was held firm. Through the top of a helmet, a screwed iron bar would then be twisted, which would drive itself into the skull of the victim. You could only imagine how much pain this would cause. Once the skull was pierced, another twist or two and it'd be game over. According to some sources we found, the torturer would often only twist enough to cause unbearable pain, and that was about the time the person wearing the helmet would give up his allies, if indeed he had any. It's likely he'd tell you anything at that point, so anyone tortured would later have to confess again when he was in better shape. There were variations of the head crusher. One of them we found doesn't have a part that pierces the skull, so the top part is just like a regular helmet. The more turns of the screw in this case would no doubt crush the jaw first and ruin a perfectly good set of teeth. Eyes would likely roll, and if the screw was turned more, then the entire head would be crushed. The victim's brain would ooze out of the helmet like melting strawberry ice cream. Yeah, that sounds about as grim as you can get, even compared to a lot of other punishments we've mentioned in this series. If the torturer put on the brakes before everything was crushed, it's highly unlikely the person would make any kind of recovery. With their jaw in pieces and their eyes missing, life wouldn't have been much fun. We actually found one website that told us one of these machines actually had a trough attached to it that collected the eyes when they burst out. But did it happen like this? Were these stories the work of Protestant propagandists that came later, or are they creations of imaginative people that have only ever seen photos of the devices online? That's the million-dollar question. We can find plenty of sources stating the torture happened this way, but they don't supply any evidence such as written accounts or even sketches. One thing we do know is that the devices exist today, most of which are in museums. Still, the Iron Maiden can be found in museums, and not many serious historians think that that diabolical contraption was ever used on anyone. Then again, people back then were pulled apart on racks. They were sawn in half from the groin up, and they were flayed alive, so it's not unthinkable that the head crusher was used. You can find other devices in museums that kinda did the same thing. One of those is what's called the skull splitter. The skull splitter looks kinda like a metal halo filled with spikes. This would be put on the person's head, and then a key would tighten the halo. The spikes would start crushing the skull, and if the key was turned more, the top of the head would be crushed. Again, we can find plenty of sources that state such a contraption was used during the Middle Ages to extract information or execute a person, but we can't find the original source of the information. Still, during that period, there was such a thing as an Inquisitor advice manual, which told Inquisitors the best way to torture someone. Rather than talk about crushing heads though, it focuses on advice about how to interrogate really tricky prisoners. There's even stuff in there about the cost of rope that was used to tie up a person about to be burned at the stake. Here's a snippet from the manual, something that sounds similar to what authorities do these days. Be sitting there, have a huge stack of documents in front of you, and as the person is answering questions, flip through the documents as if you have more information than this person could dream of, and every so often shake your head as if you can't believe what they're saying. That's quite enlightening information, but after an exhaustive search, we can't find anything about head crushing. After a bit of a deeper dive into this, it seems that such grisly torture instruments were not used very often, but for sure the person being interrogated would know what was going to happen to them if they didn't spill the beans. Can you imagine how you'd feel walking into an interrogation room and seeing a head crusher sitting on the desk? It's very likely these instruments were mostly used to scare people rather than crush heads. When people were sitting in front of the instrument of torture, this part of the interrogation was called inconspectus tormentorum. A loose translation of that could be tormented by what's in front of you. The Inquisitors kept notes of their deeds, and it seems for the most part the torture employed was hanging people up from ropes or stretching them on the rack. There are records of what people said when they were stretched, such as this: oh God, there's no mercy, oh God, help me, help me. Yeah, they actually took minutes of the torture. In conclusion, it doesn't take a great leap of faith to believe that the head crusher might have been pulled out now and again for certain people. This brings us to the device known as the knee splitter, something that looks like the gaping mouth of a monster. And again, it's highly likely the Inquisitors would have done something like waterboarding a person. Yep, they did that before they started splitting knees. Unlike the head crusher, the knee splitter wouldn't have caused a quick death. The victim might have died later from blood loss, but the crushing of some bones would not lead directly to the grave. What would happen is the person's knees were placed inside the jaws of this device, and then a handle would be turned so the jaws closed on the knees. If the Inquisitors were happy with the confession someone gave them, perhaps they would relieve the victim of his or her agony, and the knees would stay in one place. If those jaws closed all the way, well, the knees would be completely crushed, and the person would never walk again. The device was said to have manifold applications, so the arms or feet or hands could have been the body part of choice. Some sources explain that this device might have come into existence in Germany in the year 1530, but yet again, after upturning a lot of stones, we struggled to find historical records of the knee splitter ever being used. If it was used, then we guess it was only on special occasions. Most of the time, a heretic or a relapsed heretic would not have met with such creative torture, but that doesn't mean they would have ended up being burned at the stake. Lastly, we've come to the breast ripper. a similar device that caused disfigurement, but this time only used on women. These women might have been accused of aborting a baby or cheating on their husband. Sometimes called the spider, it's thought the instrument was used in Germany in the 15th century. Inquisitors might have also used the breast ripper on women accused of witchcraft or heresy or perhaps even blasphemy. Sometimes the claws on the device would be heated up until they were glowing red, which would inflict much more pain and damage. The result would be total mutilation of the accused's breasts. And yet again, finding evidence of when such an apparatus was used isn't easy at all. The instruments clearly existed, and they were likely used, especially during witch hunts. There's plenty of evidence of so-called witches being tortured on areas of their bodies they don't usually show to anyone but their lovers. You might know the name King James from the Bible he sponsored, but the man also wrote an absolutely crazy book called Demonology in form of a dialogue. This was basically an absurd treatise on demons and witchcraft. James was obsessed with witches, and he seemed to take great pleasure in ruthlessly torturing those accused of dancing with the devil. When he was the King of Scotland and not yet the King of both Scotland, England, and Ireland, James was there for the North Berwick witch trials. Many times he oversaw the torture of accused female witches, and sometimes the dreaded breast rippers were used, among other nasty things. Now you need to watch this. Bloody Mary, Mary I of England. Or have a look at this. Why did the King of England execute his wives?